Hello, this is Benjamin Brennan, Senior Associate with the Youth Economic Opportunities Network, YEO Network, at Making Sense International. The YEO Network is a community of more than 35,000 professionals dedicated to preparing youth to learn, earn, and thrive in a changing world of work. The network's goal is to improve members' ability to design, develop, fund, and implement evidence-based, innovative, and scalable youth economic opportunities programs that improve outcomes for young people globally. One-year-round activities include the annual Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit, the Youth Economic Opportunities.org Learning Hub, and year-round targeted meetings and virtual learning events. Thank you for joining today's webinar, co-hosted by RTI International and Making Sense. We're excited to have participants joining us from around the world for this webinar. We have around 162 people registered from 38 countries. Webinar participants, we welcome your questions and contributions throughout the webinar. Please write them into the chat box that's located at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Please also remember to mute your microphone so as not to interrupt the presentation. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebook posts on key points you take away from this event using the hashtag #YouthEO. On behalf of Making Sense International and the Youth Economic Opportunities Network, I want to thank RTI International and USAID for offering to co-host the event and for sharing your insights and expertise. Our moderator today is Noah Flessel, Research Governance Specialist at RTI International. Noah Flessel is a conflict and transition specialist with 9 years of program design, implementation, and project management experience for USAID-funded programs focusing on community resiliency in political transition and post-conflict environments. He brings an in-depth, cross-cutting program design perspective from working on USAID OTI programs in Kenya, Lebanon, and Libya. Mr. Flessel manages RTI's CVE working group, collaborating with researchers, subject matter experts, and field teams to link and contextualize best practice and academic thought with relevant programming opportunities. Our first speaker is Ehud Gachugu, Deputy Chief of Party, USAID's Kenya Youth Employment and Skills, KYES. Ehud Gachugu is an accomplished youth employment specialist with over 16 years of professional and technical experience in youth workforce development. Ehud holds a master's degree in business administration and is currently a PhD finalist at the University of Nairobi. Ehud worked as the executive director of Eastlake Community Center and later as the project director of the World Bank, Kenya Youth Empowerment Project implemented by Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Ehud is the Deputy Chief of Party for Kenya Youth Employment and Skills Program, a USAID-funded activity implemented by Research Triangle Institute International, or RTI International. Ehud is passionate about youth employment research and believes turning this knowledge into practice is fundamental in solving the unemployment challenge. Our second speaker is Julia Drude, Conflict Advisor at USAID. Julia Drude has been working on USAID strategies, programming, and research into countering violent extremism, conflict mitigation, women, peace and security, and stabilization since 2015. Julia joins USAID after over 5 years of working at the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where she led conflict prevention and mitigation initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. She holds a MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from the American University and a BA from Baylor University. With that, I will turn it over to Noah to introduce the topic of the webinar and to open up today's presentation.
Thank you, Benjamin. I appreciate the introduction. Appreciate Making Sense hosting this event, and appreciate the time that both Ehud and Julia are taking to talk with us today. Looks like we've got a good crowd joining us as well, and so I'd like to appreciate people taking time out of their busy morning to join us today. I think just for a very brief overview, for those of you who haven't worked in CVE, we're going to use it, phrase countering violent extremism, the definition, as the use of non-coercive means to dissuade individuals from mobilizing towards violence, particularly violence used by terrorist or violent extremist organizations. What KS is talking about, the P in it, is preventing violent extremism, so we're addressing interventions prior to anybody being actually recruited. So it's the individual resilience in an at-risk environment, but they're not actively engaged. So with that, I'm going to sprint through our introduction of KS so we can get to the meat and potatoes, which is Ehud and Julia speaking to you all. So KS is a 5-year program that supports youth employment, specifically for youth without a secondary education. So That means they dropped out of school before completing. They do a more holistic approach to development with both job skills and life skills in an attempt to increase employment outcomes. And post-training, they have options and linkages for seed funding and partnerships with employers for job placement. 3 of the counties that they work in are Nairobi, Garissa, and Kwale. And because of the larger risk and existence of violent extremist organizations, USAID saw an opportunity to partner with KS and leverage some of the community connections, specifically with youth organizations, to do additional preventing violent extremism work. And so we didn't really want to do business as usual, but we did want to stay true to the program, and we looked for natural places to focus within the positive youth development framework. Here I'm going to do a shameless plug for youthpower.org, which has a lot of nice positive youth development principles and resources that you guys can tap into. When it came to preventing violent extremism and building individual resilience, we focused on issues around agency, efficacy, self-determination, positive self-identity. All of these sort of focus on both sides of PYD for youth development, but also for PVE itself. We also wanted to make sure that our programming and our life skills focused on pro-social norms, pro-social involvement, pro-social bonding, finally really promoting higher order and critical thinking. So all of these things we would have done naturally for work, but specifically for PVE, we wanted to conduct additional work. So before we moved forward with the actual implementation, we did some initial research with our existing and previous beneficiaries to better understand their attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors. We did this through a number of different venues, but the key takeaway for us as a program in designing our interventions going forward was that they demonstrated a very limited knowledge and opportunities for community engagement outside of what we were providing. So they either felt like there weren't opportunities or they didn't know what the opportunities were to engage constructively within their community. And the second point that we sort of noticed that jumped out was this pervasive idea that an individual had to have economic success prior to being an asset to the community, prior to having anything that they could give. And so within PYD, but also for PVE, we sort of really wanted to reiterate that youth have an asset, just their own ideas, their own knowledge, that they can contribute prior to being economically successful. So at this point, we've done our RFAs, we've issued our grants, and we've just recently completed our training of trainers. And we're about to roll out the actual implementation of our updated life skills component. But without jumping too far ahead, Ehud is going to speak a lot more about the TOTs and the lessons learned, which is what we wanted to share with you. So the design of our webinar today is really to allow the participants to listen into this conversation that I'm going to have with Ehud and with Julia, and then we want you guys to become a part of the conversation. So really do think about your questions, write them down, and then use the chat function. We're hoping to have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to make sure that Ehud's mic is still working. Ehud, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great, fantastic. So Ehud, we talk a lot about doing certain things more deliberately when it comes to PVE. Could you tell us a little bit more about the steps that you've taken on KS to bring that more intentionality and what your approach is to building CVE-specific resilience within youth?
Thank you, Noah and Benjamin. I do appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be speaking with all of you today. In relationship to your question, Noah, KS has built a system whereby it works at the community level. And one of the things we did right from the inception of the program is to build a network of community trainers and also build an alliance of different organizations and actors in the space of youth employment and residence building in all our counties. This did also happen and has continued to happen in the 3 counties that you've mentioned. That's Nairobi, Garissa, and Kwale. In the 3 counties, we have trainers that trains different KS programs. That's the vocational trainings, the business skills, agribusiness, gender, and life skills. One unique thing about our trainers is that they're all drawn from the communities in which they reside and they're very familiar with. That helps us to make sure that our trainings are contextualized and take into consideration the dynamics and uniqueness of the cultural and the social situations of those communities. Previously, as you may have stated in your presentation, our key focus was providing economic opportunity for youth with some attention to other sociological needs. However, we were very much cognizant of the work of other programs that were implementing PVE, CVE activities, since one of the things that KS have managed to do is to form what we call County Youth Employment Compacts, which brings together all the different actors in a county that are implementing activities that are geared towards youth empowerment. And as such, KS had an early in-touch and intervention with those different actors. The other thing that was also happening is that as we modeled our program, we introduced life skills training, which was more geared towards preparing young people for employment. And to some extent, it did respond to their sociological needs, and by extension, was also reducing and helping young people to understand the processes of radicalization and the importance of, self-esteem, attitude, and perception and behaviors. Based on the research, as you have earlier mentioned, and also additional support from USAID, we redesigned the project interventions in those 3 counties to be more deliberate in building CV-specific resilience to the youth. And so this component that we redesigned has 4 main components. It has ID registration, social leadership trainings, stakeholders engagement, and referral system. Now, speaking more in depth about the social and leadership skills training, this training targets young people from different hotspots areas in the 3 counties. The hotspots areas were identified in collaboration with the national government, county government, and other CV actors in the 3 counties. And from there, we were able to partner with local youth organizations. And in our case, we call them County Youth Bunge Forum, which are youth organizations that are owned by the youth, they are managed by the youth, and they are also youth-led. And they have proper understanding of youth issues in their counties. And so in that partnership, we were able to select trainers from those hotspots areas. And these trainers, again, are amongst the pool of KS, like economic empowerment trainers that have been trained on different other aspects. We managed to develop a curriculum as informed by the research and also input from other actors. And that curriculum, we designed a TOT, which then these trainers were trained on. One important thing to note here, though, was that the trainers were people who have done other trainings, but they had not done CVE type of training. And therefore, they were really not subject matter experts in CVE, but they had community legitimacy because they come from the communities in which we are talking about. So each trainer was coming from a specific administrative area in the counties in which we are implementing this intervention.
Yeah, that hyper-local focus, I think, is really interesting and important. So I would say, having gone through the process of doing the TOTs with those youth trainers in 3 different counties, so what would you say are some of the themes that emerged to you in doing that process that you can share with us?
One of the most important themes that we continue to learn and that continue to emerge is the aspect of the term CVE and how the word term CVE is actually used. So doing CVE without necessarily calling it CVE looks like it's a theme that's really emerging, because the concept of CVE brings in stigmatization, and therefore then reduces the power of the training and the training experience, and by extension then makes young people block, and the outcomes of the training are actually affected. As such, KS has been able to do that by combining different elements, CVE, life skills, peer education, and community dialogues, into one package which we call social leadership training. The other thing that we have also observed is the importance of trust. In KS, one of the things that we did is to make sure that there's a legitimacy of trainers from their communities, because one of the things that kept on coming is the relational issues between young people, their communities, parents, other actors like government, and also the community itself. And so we were very deliberate in selecting trainers from local communities who understand both youth, who are also respected in the community as opinion leaders, as youth leaders, but also who have good connections with the larger administrative system in the county. Another thing that I want to mention that has been of great importance, and a theme that continues to emerge, is the need for a referral system, given that these young people, even as we continue to work with them, there are different and varying needs that are emerging, including the TOTs themselves. They have different needs for support, but they can't be able to provide holistic support, and therefore, from our point of view, to make sure that we have a holistic program, a referral system is extremely important. Lastly, the trainers that we chose come from communities, and therefore, from our perspective, we expect them that they should understand the context. So we allow trainers the space and freedom to contextualize the training materials, though we have a general material that's common to everyone, but in the specific counties and the specific courts, we were able to bring specific details, even including wordings, complex words, that can be used and young people can actually learn and appreciate and even understand, because the trainer are able to contextualize and they have the space and freedom to do so.
Yeah, and Ehud, I found that that whole process really interesting to observe. So maybe you could talk a little about what that looked like in terms of the TOTs going through the exercise of translating CVE jargon, essentially, that we talk about, into language that they would be able to use with these beneficiaries.
Yeah, for example, when we were training the TOTs in Nairobi, some CVE terms and words and language, we were able to ask the trainers, what kind of words do you think young people can understand, and what do you think this word actually means to a common young person there in your community? And so we were able to have words that are well understood but mean the same they have the same meaning to the concept that we wanted to relay. And that has also happened in all the other counties, in Garissa and in Kwale, especially Kwale, where the dominant language there is Kiswahili. We have been able to get terms that young people are able to use when they're actually training. And these words are the words that are commonly used on a day-to-day conversation by the young people. In Garissa, it's a little bit more easy because the language is Somali, and so we were able to get the right Somali words which young people use in their day-to-day conversations, and the TOTs were given these terms. They're the ones who came up with them, but they continue to use them in the rollout trainings with the beneficiaries. And this has really helped young people to understand the ideas behind and the concepts behind this CVE, and also the life skill related aspects that we're trying to bring out.
Great. And so I know KS, we're also hoping to have the trainers obviously train the beneficiaries, but also serve a dual role as an ongoing teacher and mentor within the community. So I'd like to know a little bit more about why you think this is important for resilience and important for the success within KS and the model work.
Yeah, this is important for us looking at sustainability of our action. And the role of a trainer as a mentor and a teacher is extremely important because they live with these young people in the same communities. The mentor, the trainer, knows these young people, knows where they come from, and also knows their background. And therefore, it brings in the element of young people trusting the trainer, and at the same time, the trainer has legitimacy within the community that they can be believed on, and also are much connected with other programs and activities related to CVE and also economic empowerment. So it's important that the selection of the trainers was very, very deliberate, and it was consultative, and also the trainers were members of leaders within their communities. The second point that's important is that once we are done with the training, we wanted this conversation to continue. And the two things that we actually embedded in the training was the peer education model and the community dialogues. So having a resource that can be tapped by the young people as they continue with those other activities is fundamental to ensuring sustainability of our action. But more importantly, really, is the lowering of the burden for preventive action by the trainers. This is something that seems like it's occurring naturally within the natural environments of the young people, and therefore then it makes brings this resource very close to the community and to the ground, and therefore it's important that the trainer have those dual roles, because then that's the best way to make sure that there's sustainability and also a continued reservoir where young people can draw support and referral in any needed activity.
Yeah, and so I think one point to emphasize is that these trainers are also youth themselves. So in addition to the location you mentioned, for the listeners to understand that these are sort of peers of the participants themselves. So Ehud, my last question for you before we get to Julia is just if you could explain a little bit more for the audience what you are talking about in terms of the referral system and how we want to use these mentors and community resources that are our TOTs to sort of feed into that process for us and support our work.
The referral system refers to this situation where we are able to identify the different needs of the young people that have undergone through the social and leadership skills, and be able to link them with those with the support system on the different needs that they want. For example, the way we layer the training is that we start with ID registration. All the young people who we have supported in accessing ID are then selected. Some of them are selected from multiple areas to undergo social and leadership skills training. And then from social and leadership skills training, we are able to identify the different needs of these young people. Some want talent development. Some want economic opportunity. Could it be a link to vocational training center, to business skills? So they need entrepreneurship skills. They need access to finance. But also there are those young people who require additional sociological support simply because they could have gone down the path of radicalization. And since KS is really not a CV program, we are just being CV relevant, then we create a referral system where all these needs, different needs, can be linked to different actors beyond what KS can afford and can offer. So for example, in the 3 counties, we are able to know who does CV work in general, who does economic programming, and where can we draw connections and resources that then drives young people towards the path of empowerment in a holistic manner.
Yeah, I think one thing to emphasize here is that what we heard from the TOTs was them, realizing they could be in a situation where one of their participants is really exhibiting a pretty hardened perspective, or even one of the participants going through the training, the life skills training, and saying, look, my brother is going down this road, what do I do? So to Ehud's point, recognizing that we aren't really built to provide the in-depth sort of psychosocial and community wraparound services and additional support, we do feel it's important that we have access to those resources. And so institutionally, between KS and other programs, whether government of Kenya, county, USAID, or other donor funding, that's sort of how we've built it in. So Ehud, we could talk for a day on this topic. I hope folks found it interesting, and we'll do some questions at the end. But I did want to hop over to Julia. Julia, still with us?
Hi, Noah. Yes, I'm here.
All right. Got the mute button working. So I think it would be interesting. We've taken a deep dive at KS specifically, but if you could give us a little bit more of a broader context of Kenya as our sort of country example for the day, if you could tell us a little bit more about the trajectory of CVE in Kenya, sort of how and why it's evolved in the way that it has in the last decade or so.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to participate today. Yeah, I really like the way that Ehud framed the KES program as being CVE relevant and not necessarily CVE specific as a program, because looking back at the history of USAID supported programming in Kenya, it has started out as really combining its efforts with existing and new youth programming within that sector to add a CVE bent to those different programs. And this really started in 2009 in Garissa with our G Youth program. And the focus was on youth engagement and vocational education. Yet this idea of geographically and demographically targeting youth has remained a core principle of our programming for CVE since the beginning. Programming has, like with G Youth, has expanded to include more deliberate actions of youth advocacy and linkages to local authorities. And later, even in 2012, this program was merged with a national level program called Yes Youth Can. And so it took those core principles of youth engagement, vocational education, but started focusing on creating a national system of traditional community governance and advocacy structures that were specifically for the youth. It also included some radio programming and media outreach as well. So that was the way that USAID started working on CVE programming in Kenya, was again through those very youth-targeted efforts. However, around 2010, USAID did start launching very specific CVE programs. First in Nairobi, piloting in the Eastleigh neighborhood. These continued to have a youth focus within the programming, but the deliberate objective of the programs were to counter violent extremism, engaging youth, engaging broader communities. These programs were followed by additional efforts along the coast and other hotspots, as Ehud was talking about, to focus on advocacy, youth engagement, conflict mitigation, capacity building, just identifying vulnerable communities and local interveners to support them. And so really the trajectory has been focusing on targeting youth through existing efforts and making people more aware of the threat of violent extremism. As Ehud was talking about, that's a big part of understanding how to support your fellow community members, is really understanding what the nature of the threat is. So we found that really putting a focus on awareness building and capacity building in CVE itself is a large part of working with communities, to also just strengthening systems, whether that is through action planning at the county level, at the community level, at the national level, to again those capacity building of local organizations. So that the trajectory has been, again, from very targeted youth programming to more systems building, very CVE more CVE focused programming, but youth continues to be a large focus of all of that.
Yeah, and so I think Kenya's interesting just because it's been going on for so long, but maybe thinking about other countries with different contexts, different constraints, and perhaps a different maturity level of the CVE programming itself. So what are maybe 2 or 3 of the biggest takeaways you would take from Kenya that implementers could use and help think through PVE programming with youth in other places?
Great. I want to harken back to one other thing that Ehud alluded to, and that is just the challenge of talking about violent extremism and working in this space because of the stigma attached to it, a little bit of unknowns attached to it, and certainly it just being a very sensitive sector. So it has certainly, in the work we've done in Kenya, has taken time for the youth and civil society to feel comfortable to engage in this space because of the continuous programming that USAID has supported and others have supported and various organizations have been implementing since 2009. It really has built this base of potential partners at all levels of civil society and government. So it certainly takes time to build up a level of comfort to work in this space and to create that space for open discussion, again, on what are the causes of violent extremism and the vulnerabilities for potential recruits and also potential responses. So I'd say that's one thing. A second is that Kenya is probably one of the countries that we work in that is probably the farthest along in developing this concept of a whole of society approach to building a sustainable response to violent extremism. This is in part because it's been a priority issue for the government of Kenya without having, I guess, more of late responding to the problem set with simply a security sector approach. So their willingness to engage as well with different approaches. But that has, again, evolved over time. We have to recognize that this is never just going to be a development response nor security response, but it's really all the various actors working together. And lastly, just one more, reaching the most vulnerable youth is not something that is going to be done by donor-led actions or government-led actions alone. I completely agree with Ehud that building the capacity of youth and local organizations to do this kind of work is essential to provide a peer-to-peer response in order to access the most vulnerable. That is of critical importance. Those are the key influencers in this space, is that peer-to-peer engagement. So underlining all of these, I'd say takeaways would be trust and building trust, and that takes time.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so maybe taking it up another level, up a little bit, what do you think sort of within the field of CVE? You're speaking as a PVE, CVE expert on youth. A lot of the listeners here are sort of youth operators thinking about and looking at PCVE work. What do you think the right role is, or the range of an appropriate role for youth work, youth employment work within preventing violent extremism?
That's a great question. There's been a lot of research of late to really understand what are the various factors that are driving youth to join violent extremist organizations. And a lot of the most recent research is saying that poverty and alone is not the sole driver of joining these groups of radicalization. So, however, it is certainly a contributing factor to their vulnerability to find these groups attractive. So what we have to recognize is that while economic benefits are very important to keep youth from finding a negative alternative, but it may not be enough. We found that also focusing on a sense of identity and a sense of belonging are just as, or if not more, important, because this is what makes these kinds of groups so attractive, because it gives youth that sense of identity and belonging and meaning and purpose, etc. So workforce development in and of itself is a reinforcing activity. It can certainly bring someone into the fold and away from a violent extremist group, but it cannot, as a point of leverage, but it may not be effective in and of itself by itself. That being said, tangible benefits are certainly a part of any program, that of CVE program that USAID supports. And Kenya is a very good example of this in the various youth engagement efforts that we've supported in providing access to, helping provide access to identity cards, for example, or access to micro lending opportunities. I will also just add that within this space, the right role for youth, again, is to be empowered to lead in the messaging and the communication around these efforts. Again, just to harken back to an earlier point about peer-to-peer communication is what works. And this is not unique to CVE programming. I think a lot of the youth experts right now participating acknowledge that that's critical for a lot of different sectors working with youth. But that's certainly an important one. And then lastly, taking, like I said, taking a systems-based approach, building up structures that incorporate CVE as a sustained capacity at different levels, at the individual level, the community, county level, national level, is really important to ensure that youth have an equal seat at the table, an equal voice, and they're a participant, not just a beneficiary in a lot of these processes. So again, workforce development, one of the aspects and components, but really figuring out ways to bring youth more as leaders and active participants into the fold of planning processes and implementation processes, and certainly communication as well.
Yeah, great. I think you sort of mentioned it a little bit, and I'll sort of reemphasize it here, is that working in PCVE, there's a huge spectrum and a huge range of work to be done within it, and some of it clearly is very much in the development space lane, some of it is very much in the security space lane, but there's a lot of it that's sort of in between, and I think a lot of development actors are a little bit reticent to kind of work in that gray space, even though there's a lot of work to be done. So I'd be curious to know what, from your perspective, what you've seen both in Kenya, but then thinking about, in places where it's not as mature, where we maybe don't know the degree to which the host country government buys into a non-security intervention. How do we reconcile the conflicting approaches between security sector and development?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly an ongoing challenge that we found, particularly in Kenya, is pretty far along in this kind of gray area space where development sector meets security sector. We found that when there is an opportunity to bring the various actors together through, for instance, a county level action planning process, you have that ability for those from different sectors and different perspectives to come together and mutually work on a plan that addresses the various issues that they're facing in a way that acknowledges the challenges of working together. And that's been a particularly useful process in Kenya. And it, again, because it has the weight and support of the government of Kenya's National Counterterrorism Center, it is able to bring together different players from both these sides. But it continues to be a challenge. I think that CVE presents a useful opportunity to convene these different actors, because it presents a common language and a common goal, and that helps to start to pave the way for people to understand a complex challenge and the various approaches that are needed holistically in order to see change. But it's definitely continues to be a challenge, but there's certainly other places that USAID is thinking about right now and engaging in further in the CVE space, whether that be on the rehabilitation of former combatants and the reintegration of those former combatants. That's one area that specifically that we're looking to engage more and more in. That is a highly legally restrictive space, so it's certainly very specific, locationally specific, where we're able to do some of that work. And also we're looking more at, is there space for us to work in prisons where we can again work with those that have been demobilized but not yet reintegrated. So there's definitely some unique angles that development actors can try to take that relate to the security sector as well.
Great, thanks. Well, we're right about at 20 minutes for questions, which is what we were targeting. So I think now's a good place to sort of stop, and I'll hand it over to Jillian to.
Hello? Yeah. So one question that I saw in the chat box was, does employment or economic opportunity focus include formal sector employment, or is this just for self-employment? If including formal employment, how are the skills training capacity of community-based trainers informed by and matched to the job skills and needs gaps of formal sector employers? And I think that question was for Ehud.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Benjamin. And the employment and economic opportunity focus both the formal jobs and also, which means the formal sector jobs and also informal sector jobs, both wage and self-employment. Now, we have two streams of interventions. The first one, the social and leadership element, really focuses on building young people's capacity on resilience to radicalization and violence extremism, but then they are graduated to the economic opportunity program, which then prepares them for any track of employment. So that can be either a wage job or self-employment, and those options are available within the KES. If they are not available within KES, we have other programs, for example, that are doing micro lending that we link to young people who are in need of capital to start a business. We have other programs that are also doing business development services for young people already in small business activities and they want to scale them up. And so those connections are all there, and we are able to work with the employers in all the sectors. And one of the things I didn't mention is that in every county where we work in order to help us to spur employment and increase chances of young people getting employed, we have a network of all actors, including private sector employers, who sit into that to help us mobilize different opportunities for young people to get connected to jobs and opportunities for skills development.
Yeah, and I would just add on top of that, the big emphasis here from the CVE angle is that agency, is that ability for them, for youth, to self-determine, okay, do I want to start my own business or do I want to go for wage opportunity? And that's sort of something they self-select into. That's the question.
Thank you, Ehud. We have another question regarding KYES. How has KYES resisted political pressure in the countries that were mentioned in your presentation?
One advantage that KES has is that it started working a long time with the political system in implementing the economic opportunities program. So what we normally do is that we have strong partnerships at the county level where we work with the county government, and already since the CV program started way after the economic opportunity, the relationships were built. And so KES, because of the good relationships with the local political leaders and also the administrative leaders, both at the national and also at the county level, is able to shield itself from political interferences. We have actually not had any challenge working with those leaders in implementing all our activities. So the point here is creating these early relationships and making everyone in the whole ecosystem see the benefits that are derived by this sort of intervention would help programs shield off against those interferences.
Thank you. And as a CVE-focused program, are you measuring any results related to youth perceptions regarding violence, governance, or community engagement, or other to track any results related to CVE?
Yes, we are doing with this pilot phase. We are tracking the attitude perception change. We are at analyst stage of doing that. We just designed the questions that we want answered, and therefore we will be tracking the outcomes of that. One of the things that we're also doing is to administer pre and post at the very beginning, but then gradually move that into some sort of longitudinal tracking, and we should be able to see perception change as people get different treatments in the program. For example, at the very beginning is a social leadership and ID, then we get them connected to different opportunities based with what they select, the path they select they want to move to, and then we keep on measuring that for a period of time to be able to see whether we can actually be able to see changes. At the same time, we're also collecting qualitative data to be able to establish the nuances that cannot be identified by pure quantitatives.
Thank you, Ehud. Next question that just popped up is, are psychosocial support services widely available in hotspot communities? How does the program address the lack of appropriate services?
Yeah, that continues to be a main challenge, and we are working with the programs that are really CV focused to try and build robust social support services. They do exist to some extent because there are some investments that have been done by other actors. USAID has led this. We also have, DFID and UNDP and county government, national government putting in some sort of support services. It is not yet something that we can say has really taken ground completely, but there's some sort of services that are available to young people in their own communities. One of the things that has also happened, and really this is very good for the country, is where we are grouping houses into what we call Nyumba Kumi, and this Nyumba Kumi initiative, though it's from a security point of view, it's turning out to be really like it's sort of a system where young people who have needs are able to communicate with the elders, and be able to identify some of the gaps. And if it's a question of, say, for example, security concern, the elders are able to broker that relationship between young people and the security agencies. Another thing is, for example, young people require, counseling, in-depth counseling. We are also working with programs like Niwetu and SCORE to see where else can we, apart from their already existing counseling services, where else can we send young people in case they need in-depth counseling services.
Yeah, and there was a follow-up question to add to that. So just to clarify, the referral system is through these formal partnerships with these organizations. And so the point being that our trainers and mentors themselves are in a position to, when they have a more serious case come to them, they work with us directly so we can them. And it's less about sort of making them aware and more about intentionally ensuring that connection happens, as opposed to just letting things fall as they may.
We can move on to the next question. Are there any employment policy, whether national or workplace level, lessons that have been generated so far, or recommendations that you can make?
Yeah, there are, of course, national employment policies. There are also county-specific employment policies, though at a very nascent stage of development. And as Julia said, that for us, I think one of the things that we are really learning is the importance of integrating and holistic youth employment support and giving young people different opportunities and the voice to govern their own development process. That's one very important thing that we've learned. The other thing that's extremely important is really asking ourselves the question of what really works, and therefore then, having in mind and designing, research projects within existing programs to be able to understand it better, to inform implementation, but also to contribute to larger community of practice is extremely important. The other important thing that we've learned from our policies is the issue of communicating what we are actually finding out. So important platforms like this one, where we are sharing, and exchanging experiences and learning from each other, is actually one of the elements of the larger employment services policy that in our country. The other thing that also we've seen is the coordination between the national and county governments, especially because of possibilities of duplication and redundancy and policy conflict, and therefore then policy coherence, looking at how then do we marry the national policies with the county policies, sectoral policies, with national policies, all this, whole issue about coherence. And lastly, and not the least, is the importance of coordination. All these actions will succeed where there is proper coordination. Efforts amongst, cross-sector coordination, multi-sector coordination. These are all very important things that we have learned, and KS to some large extent have been trying to work on this aspect and developing interventions that are geared towards, supporting coordination of different youth workforce development activities in the counties and to some extent to the national level.
Thank you, Ehud. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for Julia or Ehud, please write them in the chat box. We have just a couple minutes left until the end of this webinar. And continuing, we have a question for Julia regarding rehab integration and working in prisons. Knowing the significant legal barriers, U.S. laws, material support issues, and OFAC designations, UN sanctions, and host government anti-terrorism laws that challenge this type of engagement, what is USAID doing with the USG and other governments to lower the risk for the partners and enable work in this space?
Great question. We have been doing this, trying different approaches in different places. So I can give you a couple of examples. One thing that we're doing in Kenya is working in close coordination with our State Department colleagues that have the authorities and greater access to working with security and rule of law actors in Kenya. And we closely coordinate our efforts with them so that we are ensuring that we are latching up and really hitting at critical issues and sharing information on our side. In particular, our focus, I guess, in that partnership has been on, in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration, is how can the community be better prepared for supporting the former combatants that are reintegrating. That has been a significant challenge over time for former combatants of all types to be able to do that effectively, and the community to be able to successfully re-embrace them. So that's been our side of that type of support, has been working with the communities and helping those structures and those systems be strong and not neglected, but also be prepared to embrace former combatants and those that have been, because you're right, there are so many restrictions for us in working with certain types of groups and individuals and authorities. So that's where we fit in. Another example has been actually in Nigeria. USAID has been working with the government of Nigeria to help develop a framework for DDR. So that's another way that we can plug in and help create a space and a framework for how this type of work can be done in a way that creates that kind of space for more partners to work in a way that is safe for communities and those that are looking to demobilize as well. So those are a couple different ways that we have been doing it. But again, it's pretty specific to a location, to a case. So it's certainly an ongoing work that we're exploring. But those are just a few ways that we've been able to plug in.
So there was a follow-up question on, has the government of Kenya played a role towards youth radicalization? I'm going to give Julia a screen here so that she can choose to answer or not. From what we've seen, heard, and in both focus groups, one-on-ones, and in the surveys, the short answer is yes. There's a lot of extrajudicial killing, particularly in Nairobi and in Kwale, and that is counterproductive to a lot of the efforts, initiatives that we want to do. So yes, it does provide a challenge, but I think it's important also to remember in terms of the discussion that just like the USG and its different policies and arms and actors can seem incoherent, the government as a whole is also the same way. So I wouldn't use that as a blocker from finding the champions of sort of more CVE and more development focused efforts, just because there are issues within the police force and the army. Julie, you can
Sure, I'll just add. No, I think that yeah, thanks for taking a stab at it. I'd say that we could all do better. I think that governments across that region struggle with some command and control issues of their security forces or police forces, that we as a U.S. government, through a number of different avenues of the State Department or through our Department of Defense, are trying to address and support governments in addressing those issues. I think research also points to the fact that in the broader region, that security force abuses are one of the main drivers of violent extremism, radicalization, and recruitment. So I think that there's more that can be done. It's not always a deliberate tactic that is being used, but it's something that if gone unaddressed, will continue to make the problem more pervasive.
Thank you, Julia. This will probably be our last question. I think this was for Ehud. You mentioned gender integration in your framework. How do you address this?
Yeah, the bottom line for gender integration is to ensure both, young male and female have equal access to opportunities within the program. So as such, we recognize the diverse needs of youth, and specifically for men and also for women. And we design the program with that in mind, making sure the training programs are training programs that take into account the gender diversity. The other thing that we do is also to look at aspects like training time, training hours, and ensure that they are also sensitive to the needs of both young men and women. Also, some of the other thing that we do consider also the facilities in which this training is happening, to ensure they are friendly to both male and female young mothers who have children. And so holistically, what we've been trying to do is to improve the employment and training outcomes for both men and women. When we talk about working with employers, we are also encouraging young employers to employ young men and women in areas that are probably conventional, male dominated or female dominated or otherwise. So we have those conversations even happening at higher levels, so that then employers can also recognize the importance of considering equal opportunities for both male and female.
Yeah, and just on top of that, Ehud, the only, it's context specific, so I think the only county where we're doing sex disaggregated training groups is Garissa, right? We're doing mixed in both Nairobi and Kwale, but we do try and have a mix of male and female trainers within that.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right, well, that's the time on our webinar. Thank you once again to our speakers and to everyone for joining today's webinar. In a few moments, you will be directed to a 2-minute survey online. We appreciate your feedback so that we can create the most relevant and interesting learning events for you in the future. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on youtheconomicopportunities.org. You will receive a link via email. If you found this webinar useful, so will others in your networks. We encourage you to promote today's webinar. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.